Hey there! We're back to reading my book, Rumblings and Remardan. We are now on Part 2, Halflings. Now this is a longer chapter, and the chapter is called Pain, Chapter 9. The hobbits bent double in pain, and roiled around on the ground as Ineptius kicked them further. Hans Ardevart, the father of the halfling children who instigated this whole mess, felt his shins go numb under the blows of such strong and shapely dwarven legs. He could only imagine what his kids were going through. It must have been very excruciating. Thinking back, it was probably not a good idea to have enraged this bearded dwarf. He probably should have apologized for his children's misbehavior instead of doing what any father would do, no matter the race, and running to his children's aid. He should have seen the situation for what it was. Instead, he had assumed the fault of the dwarf, because, after all, when were dwarves not to blame? In this scenario it was, in fact, the halfling's fault. Hans was a very proud man, and with that came him being a very proud father. Mr. Ardevart grew to be proud under the auspices of his uncle, Manruf Notmiscot, who is indeed a great spice merchant in Remardan. Hans grew up also to be a surprisingly handsome man for a halfling. He had a stone-shaped jaw which was strangely chiseled into perfection. Short black hairs sprouted from his chin, even though he always tried to keep them in check, much unlike the dwarven tradition to let their beards grow as a sign of age and therefore respect for the elderly. The halflings laughed in the face of that utterly silly tradition, and always made sure to keep themselves well groomed by cutting their whiskers and hair. Like a crossbow bolt, Hans's nose came down, and like the arrowhead upon impact, it was also a bit broken and jagged. His dark green eyes were speckled with just a dot of brown in order to trick the eye of any viewer upon quick inspection that it looked completely brown. This Mr. Ardevart had developed an innate ability to use those eyes and his rather long, bony hands to become a great chef, which was quite strange in Remardan, since people often did not have the time to spare for such frivolous nonsense. Manref taught him to use those natural advantages to the utmost benefit and honor of the family, and, therefore, the entire halfling race as a whole. The two of them jointly opened up a stall in the market of the capital Ostanovka with a simple setup, just a huge steel pan, a table, and a drum to hold the fire. With the spices of Manref and the natural talents of Hans, it was a sure-fledged success. Flocks of halflings and all the other races of the city came to see the young hobbit do what seemed like pure magic to the food he was preparing. A little paprika, a little oregano, some cinnamon, some cayenne, and all the different spices brought by his uncle's great trade made the food utterly irresistible, and, I suppose, a little food magic never hurt either. The lizardmen would just gulp down the meat without waiting for him to cook it. All Hans had to do was mix his ingredients together, and their own fire in their bellies did the rest. Of course, everywhere that Mr. Notmiscot went, wherever he bought and sold his spices, he spread the word, talking at great length and detail about his young nephew's cooking. Soon, there were people from all over the mountains heading to Ostanovka to taste this marvelous halfling's product. Even the dwarves of the city put aside their typical reluctance and suspicion at hobbit food, in order to come down to the market whenever Hans was cooking to try whatever he made, though they did not cheer this chef on at all, or even tell their friends about him, for they would have probably lost standing in the ranks if they did so. Eventually, the tiny stand proved to be too little to engage all of his customers. It proved incredibly profitable. So Mr. Ardevart put his whole life savings into a medium-sized tavern in the city to feed more people and get more clientele, since, in his opinion, the customer was mostly right. The crown authorities started to take special interest because they could never believe that a halfling could be useful at anything except for numbers. Daily inspectors would come down to his tavern in order to see that the quality was right for everything that Hans was cooking, and to increase their taxes whenever there was a busy season in the capital. The war had brought most of the nobility to Ostanovka. The tavern flourished especially under the support of certain dvarnin, who wanted Hans's private catering at their events. Even some made the command decision to start setting aside funds in a private account with the enterprising halfling to ensure that they were always the ones served first. There were even instruments and instances where attacks were lobbied against the tavern by those who disliked hobbits and their success. Vandalism on the walls and broken windows, even assaults against Hans by dwarves and others. People who despised that hobbit and who thought he was going to poison the city attacked him. Manreft got out of the business from helping out on a daily business basis to simply supplying spices for Hans, for which he was well paid for all of his services. Manreft eventually settled down into a cozy cottage in the forest that surrounded the city, a nice house with 2 floors and a staircase leading to the sauna right next to the pond. Earlier in life, before he started wandering around from city to city and nation to nation, Manreft had met his sweetheart, Micah. He was traveling along his prescribed spice route, which he always did throughout Remardan, when he happened upon a comely village girl working on the flowers outside of the tavern to make it look pretty for the newcomers who traveled through every day. Sure, it was only a few groats for a day's pay, but still it was better than tilling the earth in order to grow wheat for the daily porridge. She had known little before about life outside of the village, until Manreft had started to stop by and regale her with tales of the different places which he had seen and been to. Halflings were not known for their discriminating tastes and lovers, so courting a human was not so far-fetched, even if this girl was a serf. She seemed not to notice his presence at first, for she had to crane her neck simply to look him in the eyes. Manreft was not really the adventurous type. Most hobbits weren't really. Always he hired several guards to protect his trade goods from whatever bandits or brigands or evil creatures that might want a taste of his spices or flesh. He mostly stuck to the several villages which grew and made their own different and very varied spices. It was a quite profitable venture, since most of the serfs were too simple to understand the value of their products, and so he got them at an almost ridiculously cheap price. After several years of stopping by Micah's village and chatting with this girl who grew into a rather pretty woman, the two began to fall in love with each other, and of course her parents helped to ensure that she was at work so that she could be there every time he came by, since one less mouth to feed is always better, and giving her to a rich merchant was great, even though he was a halfling. They were eventually married, though unconventional as it was, with him being a halfling and her being a simple serf girl. Everyone rejoiced because Manreft distributed to every hut in the village a wedding present. Here a good metal spoon, and there a nicely painted beer stein, to assuage the fears of some of the more hardy men in the village with tempting alcohol. To her parents Manreft gave 3 fresh-looking dairy cows, which he had procured at a local fair along with his prescribed spice route throughout the villages. The parents were more than a little delighted by this generous gift, and readily agreed to hand their daughter over in marriage to this delightful little halfling. Manreft got permission from the ruler of the village also in order to ask for her hand. Micah was excited and astonished by this fortuitous turn of events for her. She always had been pleased to talk to Manreft. She had started to grow feelings in her heart for him, though she could not imagine such a wealthy merchant to want to stoop so low as to marry a serf, especially a serf human. The now happy couple were soon brought down to the local spring and dipped in the fresh water that was pouring out of the ground and rocks, and blessed by the priests of Vodaria. It was more of a serf's religion, since the official state-run one was, for the most part, looked on with suspicion, though plenty of people both high and low still believed firmly in the religion which their ancestors did. So the state priests did fine, and Groganus prospered. Those who looked poorly upon the delighted couple spat over their shoulders, and planned to bring this rich halfling merchant down to his more natural size. The plotters gathered together in the dark for many nights to plan their attack on the hapless couple. After seeing Manreft come to their lazy little village time and time again, they had grown to resent and hate him for the wealth he had. Unfairly gotten, they'd say, using some no-good dirty hobbit tricks, probably swindling good folk out of their hard-earned money. Luckily, Manreft was always relatively smart and knew that people were the same throughout most places, that people tended to envy and hate those with more wealth than they had, and wanted to make everything fair, even if they had never worked hard nor smart in their paltry lives. And so these men and women who wanted to make everyone equal planned to bring Manreft down to their levels. These types of people learned especially from the traveling elves of Hleb, who spread their notions, concepts of an equal society without Varning and without betters. They spread it with zealotry. Manreft and Mika were happily married, and a week-long celebration began. There was plenty of rousing dances and singing with people playing to the fiddle and banjo and other varied instruments. Of course, Hans catered the whole thing himself in charge of about 10 chefs of all sorts. Humans, dwarves, halflings, elves, and even some lizardmen. Hans was an open-minded sort of halfling who respected the hard-working nature of anyone who had a special talent for cooking. He knew how much hard work had to be put into it to be good at it, and how difficult it can be to find a good person to work for, especially after having his business attacked in Ostanovka. Hans was taking a break from the city for a short while to see personally to this wedding, and so he had at once volunteered to journey to the village to see to it. There were plum cakes and rhubarb pies and stuffed pheasants, with mashed potatoes and gravy popping out of them, and all manner of fish, both long and short, with sour cream and capers spread all over them, fresh from the large flowing river Ulaga, which the village was on the banks of. Every night the whole village went home from the glowing wedding tents to content with their lots in life, having been stuffed with beer and vodka and tasty delicacies the likes of which they could never have hoped to comprehend. Manreft made a rousing speech on the third day of festivities. He was not the most charismatic of public speakers, but that tiny little body and rotund belly certainly shouted louder than anyone could have imagined. Everyone gathered in the tent under the bright torches that made the canvas billow and breathe from heat. Manreft climbed onto the stage, which was hastily erected for just this occasion, and grabbed Mika by her jewel-encrusted fingers. Manreft had spared no expense in outfitting his lovely bride with the most luxuriant of gemstones that his spice money had earned him. They glittered sweetly on her fingers, like pieces of candy floating across the hand in tints of green to match her eyes. He swayed a bit on the top of the platform as he started to throw his roaring voice at the crowd. I want to thank you all of you, simple serfs, for being here with me. You are the salt of our grand old land, and without you, I'd be in no position to provide such delicacies and delicious spices to you good folk. I've always thought that, really, my success in life was due to the simple people who made it quite possible to create such a great feast for you all, if I don't say so myself. This village has been such a pleasure to visit over the years. I'd say that some of you have grown to know me, and certainly grown taller than me. The crowd certainly did like the halfling's wit and banter over the years, and of course no one would think of not laughing with the amount of vodka in their bellies. Manruft continued smiling. There was one girl who I looked forward to seeing, and so I came here and went straight to her to tell my most recent tales, and see the smile that crept up onto her face whenever I came coming around the corner. And here we are, finally married. Here's to you, Micah. With that, a great clap and clamor went up with the serfs, all cheering for the happy couple. Micah looked quite beautiful with her large, languorous grin on her face, and her eyes shining with happiness. Her white wedding dress billowed in the torchlight. There was quite a buzz in that place, with every person running about, trying to grab as much food as they could stuff their serf mouths with. The lord of this village, named Ovlachk, was called Jandarin. He was invited also, of course, and he hastily accepted after realizing who this halfling was, and who was cooking for the event. Jandarin was a typical Gersog of this quaint little village. He was a bit plump, though still strongly muscled as most dwarves were, and his beard reached down to cover his round stomach. Still, he was required to serve in the eminent prince's army, as every Gersog was called on to do with his local Reitzars. Every Sunday he went out to practice sword fighting with the Reitzars he kept on retinue. They got up at the crow's call to his great disappointment and fought with heavy, dull practice swords to increase his strength week after week. Jandarin, however, still lived off of his serfs and ate well in the evenings after a good day of hunting pheasants, with the serfs sometimes starving on his doorstep. He wasn't all bad, though. Whenever there was an abundance of crops from that autumnal harvest, Jandarin would hire out his private chef to make an enormous meat pie for everyone to enjoy, and he would bring a keg or two of ale out from his private cellars. The whole village would have a chance to drink and eat in celebration, though it really did not compare to this magnificent wedding feast at all. Now, the group of serfs who had enough of the halfling's richness and wealth decided to interrupt the merriment one night. They broke into the tents, axes swinging and pitchforks and spears pointed at the ready. Manruft had suspected something might occur, so before the wedding he commanded his guards not to drink, and had even hired a local Reitzar, a highly trained fighting machine. Most of the guards were wearing simple studded jerkins of various shades of brown and gray, whereas the Reitzar had on his chainmail and tunic, with a typical black and white chevron pattern, with only a coif and pauldrons so that nothing blocked his visibility. Many a village girl came up to giggle and flirt with him before they all started to notice the dangerous glint in his dark brown eyes, which denoted seasoned action, even to those who had not yet known war. Immediately people started to scream and shout and run over the place, upturning tables and drinks and pies in the process. A spear rammed through the nearest mercenary, who had barely enough time to draw his axe and level a prayer to whoever might be listening. The spear had punctured his abdomen, with blood spurting out, and his newly eaten meal coming onto the floor as the spear was pulled back. He fell, face down, into his digested pie. Similar deaths played out across the tent space as Manruft and Hans grabbed the nearest weapons they could. A sturdy saucepan for Manruft, and Hans's trusty chef's knife that he was already using to slice up a cake could easily be turned to slicing up other things. Jandarin quickly leapt up, drawing his trusty one-handed sword out of the patterned leather sheath it was encased in. He swung it at the nearest serf with an axe in his hand. The serf was mid-swing as Jandarin dodged to the side and wobbled a bit from the moonshine he had been drinking earlier. He sliced from right to left into the peasant's gut, spilling out this serf's innards. The rabid serfs did not bother discriminating between the halflings people versus their own village fellows. Pitchforks ran through women and men who could not defend themselves, while every guard was fighting at least 3 people. With such unfortunate odds against Manref's people, there was little to be done. Manref and Hans delved into the fray near Jandarn to back him up, as he was almost surrounded by the serfs with their axes and spears that tore at his chainmail. Luckily, the serfs did not see the halflings coming, blinded as they were by bloodlust and rage against their perceived oppressors. A stocky young man with blond hair that reached his neck was the first to be hit with the frying pan of Manref, as it made a ringing crunch on this man's skull. Hans plunged his knife succinctly into another woman's knee to cut her tendon, like any good cook would know how to do. She stumbled and fell away from him, gasping at the pain and shock of such a little person inflicting such great death on her. Jandarn held his sword parallel to his body in order to parry a blow from a big old hickory club. He struck through it, the club catching on the sword's edge, so he stabbed through that into the disarmed peasant. The serf doubled over onto Jandarn's sword, just at the moment he was pulling it out from some other smelling-looking big old serf. He struck his leg with the blade of his woodcutter's axe, and Jandarn was downed in a scream, most unbefitting of a Dvarnin, especially a Gersag, though a Reitsar came to his aid before the serf was able to finish him off. The Reitsar deftly whacked the serf in his back with a spiked mace, which was already bloodied from the fighting. It got ever more sanguine with each swing, as the spikes bit into flesh like a city dog that has been kicked and beaten and gone without food for 3 weeks. Most of the serfs stood no chance in the face of their betters. The more professional hired bodyguard, and especially the fierce armed resistance of the Reitsars. One by one the serfs fell to the swift strokes and aimed blows of Manref's people. The serfs had not planned for such heavy fighting, and were not equipped for it, bearing only spears, clubs, and the like. And that's the end of chapter 9, Pain. I'm sorry, I said it'd be a long one, but I got it mixed with chapter 10, Revolutionaries. Hope you all enjoyed me reading Rumblings and Remardan. Of course, like, subscribe, and share, and actually do it. Don't just not do it. But thanks for watching, if you made it this far. Look forward to the next one also.